Most fantasy openings don't fail because of bad ideas, they fail because they don't grab the reader fast enough. In fantasy, there's always so much to set up, world building, magic, history, but if you don't make people care in those first few sentences, none of that matters. After 25 years of writing and studying fantasy, I've seen what makes an opening truly captivating, and in this video I'm reviewing 3 new submissions from members of the Tale Tinkerers Guild. I'll walk you through what works, what I'd adjust, and how I personally approach crafting a fantasy opening meant to keep readers hooked. The first submission comes from Agitated Aggregator and brings us an opening that builds atmosphere and tension, but might be missing a key ingredient. Max crouched low on the gnarled branches of the canopy, his breath steady despite his thunderous pulse. Sweat darkened his clothes, and his black hair clung to his temples after hours of searching. He listened intently to the rustling undergrowth, the chirps and croaks echoing across the forest below. However, the complete silence of large animals, predators and prey alike, suggested Max was once again on the right trail. His sharp grey eye scanned the forest floor below, darting over patches of moss, fallen logs, and the occasional scurrying rodent. Nothing large enough to be considered a snack by his quarry. Now this does something very right. It drops us directly into the moment. We aren't bogged down in backstory, we aren't wading through exposition, we're there, seeing what Max sees, feeling the unnatural silence around him. That's a huge strength if you ask me. I come across way too many fantasy openings that start with too much world and too little character experience for my own taste. Agitated Aggregator avoids that here. Now there is something interesting about this opening that I think is worth pausing on. Max is in the canopy, high above the forest floor, moving through the trees like it's second nature. That raises a lot of questions. Is he a highly skilled human, comfortable moving at heights where most wouldn't dare? Or is he not human at all? The text doesn't tell us outright, but that's not a bad thing. The best openings invite curiosity without forcing explanations too soon. And that's exactly what's happening here. It makes the reader lean in. But while this setup is intriguing, I wouldn't say the forest itself feels threatening. The silence of large animals, both predators and prey, suggests something is off. But what does that silence actually mean? Does it mean something dangerous is close? Likely his quarry. But if so, should Max feel a spike of tension, a moment where his instincts scream at him to stop and hold? Or is he the reason for the silence, maybe? The apex predator whose mere presence has muted the usual sounds of the wild. If that's the case, I'd want to see something that confirms his dominance, even subtly. Passing thought about how no other creature dares to move when he hunts, or how he's used to this unnatural quiet. This is a kind of fine-tuning I focus on when I revise my own openings, figuring out what impression I'm creating and making sure it's clear but not over-explained. Right now the silence is mysterious, but its implications aren't guiding the reader strongly in either direction. A little more clarity through Max's own thoughts or reactions could solidify its impact for me. Which brings us to something I think would make this opening even stronger. Personal stakes. Right now Max is tracking something, but why does this matter to him personally? I find that openings hit harder when they don't just describe a moment, they give us a sense of urgency behind that moment. What does Max stand to lose if he doesn't find what he's looking for? If this is just another hunt, does failure mean hunger? If it's more than that, does failure mean disappointment, shame, maybe even danger? Without something internal anchoring this, the scene risks losing tension too early. Here's how I would adjust the flow while keeping the original intent intact. Max crouched low on the gnarled branches of the canopy, his breath steady despite his thunderous pulse. Sweat darkened his clothes, his black hair clung to his temples after hours of searching. Still, nothing. He listened intently to the rustling undergrowth, the chirps and croaks echoing across the forest below. But no movement from anything larger. No heavy steps breaking twigs or distant breathing shifting the air. Max's grip tightened against the bark. He shifted his weight, scanning the forest floor. Patches of moss, fallen logs, the occasional scurrying rodent. Nothing large enough to be considered a snack by his quarry. Time was running out. This revision keeps everything that worked in the original, Max's experience, the world around him, the feeling of the hunt, but it now tightens the tension and adds a stronger internal weight. At least it does so for me personally. One of the biggest refinements here was in how the silence is framed. In the original we got the physical details of the world, the eerie quiet of the larger animals, but it didn't tell us what Max made of it. That moment of silence was intriguing, but it sat at a distance in my opinion. It was something happening around him rather than something he reacted to. Now the revision shifts that. Instead of describing the quiet and leaving the reader to wonder, we now see how Max processes it in real time. There's no hesitation or uncertainty, his reaction tells us exactly what this means without needing an explicit explanation. That's something I always try to look at when I revise an opening. If a character is skilled, experienced, or has lived in this world long enough, the knowledge should come through in how they react. They don't have to tell the reader this is dangerous. The way they move, think, and adjust their actions should already be communicating that. There's also a refinement here in how tension is maintained. The original version built a strong sense of atmosphere, but in the final moments, some of that tension bled out. The last lines describe Max scanning the forest floor, listing the moss, the logs, the rodents. But by the time we reached nothing large enough to be considered a snack by his quarry, the scene had started to settle rather than escalate. That's why the revised version doesn't let it taper off. It lets the description of the environment lead straight into the weight of the moment. Max grips tightens, he shifts his weight, scanning the forest floor. The familiar details are still there, patches of moss, fallen logs, the scurrying rodents, but this time, we aren't just seeing them, we're feeling what Max feels as he looks. And then, instead of trailing into neutrality, we land on the pressure that's been building. Time was running out. That last sentence works for me because it doesn't add new tension, it just confirms what's already been building. We don't need to know why he's running out of time. The scene doesn't explain it, but it delivers just enough pressure and a sense of personal stakes that we feel it anyway. You see, one of my favorite things to play with in openings is sentence structure as a tool for tension. Longer, flowing sentences tend to immerse the reader in a world, pulling them through descriptions in a way that feels natural and effortless. Short, clipped statements break that rhythm, forcing focus, making a single thought land harder. That's why Still Nothing sits on its own. It's not just a sentence, it's a moment of realization, a breath of waiting. That waiting is the real source of tension. The original submission already did many things very well, but from my point of view, the adjustments give it that extra sharpness, that extra feeling of control, where every sentence isn't just there for description, but for maximum impact. Now, having said that, let's switch gears from an opening that builds suspense slowly to Pete's submission, a high-speed, high-stakes mission right from the start. Sliding down the chimney of the Dornwick estate, Olera landed on the roof with a soft thud. Dust and soot swirled around her, covering her in grime, partially masking a tattoo of the Black Rose Society. Moonlight pierced through gaps in the clouds. She glanced at her watch. 12 hours remained before the Sovereignty's processing chambers consumed her brother Torvin's mind. Soot crunched under Olera's boots as she crept towards the heavy glass roof of the building. The ballroom below was a pool of light. Chandeliers blazed, their reflections dancing on polished surfaces. A high-pitched laugh, sharp and insincere, pierced the glass, followed by a chorus of similar sounds. Now, this is a very different approach from the last opening, and I have to say I love how it just throws us straight into motion, urgency, and personal stakes. Unlike Max's scene, which unfolds slowly, building tension through the silence, this one launches straight into the mission. There's no setup, no easing in, just a skilled infiltrator in action, a ticking clock, and a problem that needs solving right now. This kind of immediate momentum is something I really appreciate in fantasy openings when it's done well. Some stories benefit from a slow burn start, letting atmosphere do the work. Others, like this one, thrive on moment and pressure, giving us just enough detail to keep up without losing clarity. And clarity is key here. A lot is happening in this first passage. Olera is descending a chimney, landing on a rooftop covered in soot, glancing at her watch and working against a deadline to save her brother. That's a lot of information in a very short space. And yet it doesn't feel overwhelming. Why? Because the sentences break the details up in a way that makes them easy to absorb. Let me show you how I read this. Sliding down the chimney of the Dornwick estate, Olera landed on the roof with a soft thud. Right away, this tells us where she is, what she's doing, and how she's moving, all in a single clean sentence. No excess words, no clunky phrasing, it's precise. But let's take a closer look at what follows. Dust and soot swirled around her, covering her in grime, partially masking her tattoo of the Black Rose Society. There's a lot happening in this one line as well. We're getting atmosphere, the dust and soot giving us a sense of where she is and what kind of environment she's navigating. We're getting a visual detail as well. She's covered in grime, which not only grounds us in the scene, but also reinforces the physicality of her movement. And we're getting world building, her tattoo which hints at her affiliation. But here's also where I'd refine it. The way it's phrased, her tattoo of the Black Rose Society, is giving us more than Olera herself might be thinking in this moment. Does she mid-infiltration actively think of it as her tattoo of the Black Rose Society? Or would she just register it in a more instinctive way, the way someone familiar with a mark on their skin would? If the goal is to introduce the tattoo as a world-building element, we might not need to name its full meaning just yet. If it's more about the visual, then a small shift could keep it natural while still creating intrigue. Something like, dust and soot swirled around her, covering her in grime, darkening the ink curling up her forearm. Now the tattoo is still there, still important, but it's left for the reader to wonder about rather than being explained outright. The detail lingers, but it doesn't call attention to itself more than it needs to in a moment where Olera is focused on movement. This is another thing I always try to keep in mind in my own writing. If a character is in the middle of a tense situation, how much of the world will they actually be thinking about versus just reacting to? The goal for me is to keep the visual cues strong while making sure they feel like natural pieces of the character's lived experience. But now let's look at the next beat here. Moonlight pierced through gaps in the clouds. She glanced at her watch. 12 hours remained before the Sovereignty's processing chambers consumed her brother Tovin's mind. This is the core hook of the entire opening. 12 hours, a ticking clock, a personal immediate stake that makes it clear why Olera is here. This works because it doesn't overload us with explanation. We don't need to know exactly what the Sovereignty's processing chambers are. We don't need a detailed history of what they do or why they exist either. We only need to understand what they mean for Olera right now. If she doesn't succeed, she loses her brother. I think this is a crucial aspect to always keep in mind. What's the minimum amount of information needed for a moment to land? If this had gone into more detail, explaining how the chambers work, why they are used, what the Sovereignty's policies are, it would have diluted the urgency. Instead, it gives us just enough to create pressure here. And then we get the transition to the setting below. Suit crunched under Olera's boots as she crept towards the heavy glass roof of the building. The ballroom below was a pool of lights. Chandeliers blazed, their reflections dancing on polished surfaces. A high-pitched laugh, sharp and insincere, pierced the glass, followed by a chorus of similar sounds. The contrast here is fantastic. Olera is moving in darkness, covered in soot, pressing for time. And below her, the world is golden, polished, seemingly untouched by urgency. But let's look at that last sentence. A high-pitched laugh, sharp and insincere, pierced the glass, followed by a chorus of similar sounds. Now, this absolutely conveys what I think the story wants it to convey. It tells us that the people below are laughing, that there's something off about the laughter, that it feels artificial or forced. But the phrase sharp and insincere tells us how to interpret the laugh instead of letting us experience it the way Olera does. What if we don't tell the reader the laughter is fake here, but instead show it in the way it interacts with the space? Something like, laughter pierced the glass, too high, too bright, Olenga's fingers curled into a fist. With that final adjustment, this opening lands with sharper impact. Olera's experience of the world feels immediate, and her final reaction adds an undercurrent of tension without over-explaining. Now, instead of the narrative telling us that the laughter is off, we experience its discordant sharpness alongside her. And the simple act of curling her fingers into a fist, it says more about what she's feeling than any exposition ever could. But moving on here, we've seen two very different approaches to a fantasy opening. One builds slow suspense through silence, the other threw us straight into movement and high-stakes urgency. Our final submission from TrayStation 64, though, takes yet another approach entirely. One that leans into mystery, unease, and a sense of history pressing down on the present. The night bled silver across the ruins of the Skywarden Citadel. Ishara Highwind knelt among the wet shattered stones, her dark fingers brushing the sigils carved into the foundation. Names lost to the wind, etched in a language only whispers remembered. He breathed deep. The air hinted of rain, though no storm had yet come. A downpour would drown this place, be days before we could return. Unlike the previous submissions, which focused on immediate tension or fast-paced action, this one slows down, inviting us into a world that feels old, weathered, and heavy with meaning. And that first sentence, it sets the tone beautifully. The night bled silver across the ruins of the Skywarden Citadel. Right away, the word choice is doing a lot of work here. Bled makes the night feel active, almost like something is seeping across the ruins rather than simply illuminating them. That slight sense of movement, of something shifting, already makes this feel less like a static description and more like something alive. Then we get ruins of the Skywarden Citadel. There's implied history here, but the story doesn't stop to explain it. It trusts the reader to absorb the name, to feel the weight of something once grand, now reduced to rubble, and to wonder what happened. That's an excellent way to pull a reader in without exposition dump, giving them just enough to feel the presence of the past and let their curiosity fill in the gaps. But now let's talk about Ishara's introduction. Ishara Highwind knelt among the wet shattered stones, her dark fingers brushing the sigils carved into the foundation. Names lost to the wind, etched in a language only whispers remembered. Now that last name Highwind makes me pause here. Not because it's a bad choice, it's strong, it does carry a strong sense of weight. But I do wonder if it's necessary to be included at that moment. Right now we're stepping into a deeply personal, almost sacred moment. Ishara is kneeling in the ruins, touching the past, engaging with something silent and forgotten. The way the scene is framed, we're close to her actions, her thoughts, her immediate experience. But her last name, especially one with a title-like quality like Highwind, creates a slight shift in distance for me personally. If the narration is omniscient, the last name could make sense here. It's presenting Ishara as a known figure, someone important beyond just this moment. But if the story's perspective leans closer to her own experience, then dropping the last name here might make the introduction feel more natural, more immediate. The question is, would she think of herself as Ishara Highwind in this moment, or just Ishara? A simple shift here, Ishara knelt among the wet shattered stones, keeps us inside the scene without adding any distance. The name can always be introduced later when the story calls for it. That said, the rest of this introduction is incredibly strong in my opinion. She kneels, which suggests reverence, exhaustion, or deep contemplation. She traces the sigils, which implies a connection to the past, but we don't know yet whether she's deciphering, mourning, or simply remembering. And then we get names lost to the wind. That phrase alone carries so much quiet tragedy. These weren't just words carved into stone, they were people whose names were spoken once but are now barely even remembered. It creates a sense of finality, of history slipping away, and that sets the emotional tone for the entire scene. Now after this, we also get this line here though, which does something even more powerful, etched in a language only whispers remembered. This isn't just saying that the language is old, it makes us feel its decay. Something is remembered only in whispers, it's on the edge of being lost entirely. That's such a delicate but effective way of conveying how time erodes the past. This truly is something I love about strong fantasy openings, using language itself to reflect the world's themes. Instead of telling us this place is ancient, its people long forgotten, the writing lets us experience that loss and how the details are delivered. At the end then, the last line shifts us into something immediate again. A downpour would drown this place, be days before we could return. Now based on how the dialogue is formatted in the original submission, I'd assume Ishara is speaking here. If that's the case, her name suggests someone measured, deliberate, possibly with a formal or poetic edge. That means this phrasing could work better in my opinion, like a downpour would drown this place, it'll be days before we can return. This here keeps her speech smooth and natural, fitting a character who might have a more thoughtful, almost weighty way of speaking. But if the casual clipping tone in the original properly represents how she speaks, then it does work of course as is. Now in the case that this isn't Ishara speaking at all because someone else is in the scene here, then I'd consider dropping the dialogue to a new line to make it clearer that a second voice is entering the scene. Either way though, the transition to dialogue here is a great move for the pacing of the scene. First, the mention of rain makes the world feel dynamic again. We aren't just seeing the ruins as they exist now, we're anticipating how they'll react to the environment. That's what makes a setting feel alive. It's not just backdrop anymore, it's something that changes, erodes, and reacts. Second, this is the first spoken line in the opening. That's an important choice. Notice how it isn't tagged. There is no she said or someone muttered. And yet we don't need it. The statement lands with weight because the focus isn't on who is speaking, it's on the idea itself. That lack of attribution creates immediacy. It makes the readers feel like they're already in the moment, already close enough to the characters that they don't need to be told who's talking. And the phrasing, days before we can return, introduces the first hint of urgency. They don't have time to waste here. This is a great layering of history, emotion, and forward motion at the same time. For me, the best stories don't just describe a setting, they let us feel the weight of it while keeping the story moving. And that's exactly what this opening accomplishes. Instead of relying on action or immediate danger, it draws the reader in through absence of people, of memory, of time itself. The ruins aren't just remnants of the past, they are still changing, still vulnerable to the elements, and Ishara's presence here feels like a quiet act of defiance against that loss. It's a slower, more atmospheric approach, but that doesn't mean it lacks tension. The urgency is there, it's just woven into the moment rather than forcing itself forward. And that's why this one works, if you ask me. Having said that, we've now seen 3 different ways to open a fantasy story. One that builds suspense through silence, one that throws us into immediate action, and one that leans into atmosphere and history. But what about your story? If you want to build a story that keeps readers turning pages all the way to the end, you need more than just a strong opening. So watch this video here next where I'll show you the exact framework that saved me months of rewriting and helped me actually finish my fantasy novels.